It's evening now, time to dim your lights, settle under something warm. Maybe turn on a fan for a low hum that could pass for prairie wind. Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, where we travel through time very slowly, with no risk of frostbite or gunfire. Before we start, a polite bit of housekeeping. Like and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of gentle, drowsy history. And if you'd like, comment below where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. We always like to know which corner of the world is dozing off with us tonight. Now, take a deep breath. The year is somewhere in the 1880s. Outside, snow piles against a rough plank wall. You wake up in a one-room cabin somewhere on the frontier, Wyoming maybe, or Dakota Territory. The fire is low, the night is long, and you are about to discover how people manage to sleep through brutal western winters. The first sound you hear is wood, not the crack of it, but the long, deep groan of timber reluctantly existing in the cold. The logs shift slightly, rubbing against each other with a tired sigh, as if the entire cabin resents being awake at this hour. Outside, the wind has opinions. It presses its full weight against the walls, tests every seam, and whistles through the smallest gaps it can find. The result is a chorus of noises so familiar that you no longer startle. The groaning of wood, the shriek of wind, the dry rustle of snow brushing against the roof, fits your nightly symphony of survival. You lie there half awake, staring into the near dark. The faint orange from the dying stove paints uneven shadows across the planked ceiling. Every few minutes, one of the boards expands with a dull pop, like the sound of a faraway gunshot muffled by snow. The smell is a mix of pine sap, smoke, and damp wool. Somewhere nearby, a pair of boots thaw too close to the fire, filling the room with that particular scent of singed leather and hope. The cabin isn't much to look at. Just for log walls and a roof that seems perpetually confused about whether it wants to stay attached. There's a small window on one side, permanently fogged and rimmed with frost so thick it looks sculpted. The glass distorts the world outside into pale shadows, bare trees, snowdrifts, maybe a fence if you squint. You could almost imagine a neighbor nearby, though you know there isn't one for miles. You pull the blanket higher, stiff from smoke and rough to the touch, but it's better than the cold air that sneaks in from the floorboards. The wind has a way of finding you, no matter how tightly you tuck yourself in. It slides under the door, curls around your ankles, and reminds you that you are only borrowing warmth, never owning it. In the Wild West, a cabin wasn't a home, it was a negotiation with nature. You didn't build it to be comfortable. You built it to be endurable. There's a difference. Comfort is a luxury that implies choice. Endurance is what you settle for when choice is left the territory entirely. Each crack in the wall, every uneven plank, tells you exactly how rushed or desperate the original construction was, but it holds, mostly. And that's good enough for another night. The walls are lined with whatever could plug the wind, rags, moss, even paper scraps from an old newspaper, teeny headlines about cities you'll probably never see. Between the gaps, you might glimpse the packed snow outside, glowing blue in moonlight. That faint light, cold but steady, seeps in and dances with the fading orange of the coals. It's a strange harmony, one part deathly winter, one part fragile life. If you listen closely, you can hear another sound beneath the groaning wood, the whisper of snow sliding from the roof. It lands with a soft thump, muffled and final. Each time it happens, a little of the roof's weight lessens, and you can almost hear the cabin breathe easier. Out here, even buildings have moods. Some nights they creak like they're gossiping with the wind. Other nights they go perfectly still, as if holding their breath during a blizzard's worst fury. You turn slightly, trying not to disturb the quilt too much. Every movement lets in a slice of cold air, sharp and immediate. The bed frame, handmade and unsteady, groans in sympathy with the cabin. Somewhere in the corner, a metal pot cracks from the cold, just enough to remind you that everything here, from tools to people, is brittle in winter. And yet there's a kind of peace in it. You've grown used to the idea that warmth is not a constant but a reward. Each spark of the fire is a victory. Each night survived is another notch against the impossible odds of weather. The noise of the wind becomes less a threat and more a kind of lullaby, an unpleasant one, perhaps, but familiar. Like the hum of an old refrigerator in a too-quiet apartment centuries later, It's the sound of being alive in an otherwise indifferent world. You think about the people who built this cabin, maybe 5, 10 years before you. They probably stood where you are now, breathing steam into the air, cursing the same draft under the same door. They may have added that extra layer of bark to the wall or hammered in that bent nail above the stove. Every sound you hear is their legacy, a kind of architectural sigh passed from one frozen inhabitant to the next. As you lie still, the stove lets out a faint clunk. The metal has cooled to the point where it shrinks against itself. You'll have to get up soon, stir the coals, add another log. But for now, you linger in that fragile warmth, hoping the fire holds a bit longer. You pull the blanket up to your chin, close your eyes, and let your mind drift between wakefulness and dream. The line between them feels thin, and the cold thoughts wander slowly, like snowflakes settling. You picture yourself outside, looking at this cabin from a distance, the only dot of orange light in a vast white world. It looks lonely, yes, but also stubbornly alive. Outside, the wind shifts direction. Cabin creaks in response, wood answering sky. It's a sound that says, "We're still here." And somehow that's enough. You breathe in the faint warmth, exhale fog into the darkness, and think, not for the first time, that survival is just another form of patience. Tomorrow, you'll wake with a sore back and a half-frozen nose. You'll grumble and stretch and add more wood to the stove. But for now, you let the cabin's groaning lull you, its rhythmic protest turning into a sort of reassurance. After all, a structure that complains is a structure still standing. You wake before dawn, the kind of hour where even the darkness feels tired. The air inside the cabin has teeth against sharp little bites that find their way through every opening in your blanket. The fire, loyal as it is, can't fight a full night of prairie wind. Its glow is gone, replaced by a dim red heart of ash. You stay under the covers a little longer, not because you're cozy, but because you're calculating the price of leaving. The cold out there will win. It always does, eventually.
Oh.
But for now, you make a cocoon of what you have. Blankets, quilts, and questionable warmth. Your bedding, if one can call it that, isn't uniform or elegant. It's a collection of everything that ever pretended to be fabric. There's an old quilt patched together from the shirts you wore 2 years ago, stitched with thread that breaks if you breathe on it too hard. There's a coarse wool blanket you bartered off a trapper, thick but itchy enough to remind you you're still alive. Underneath all that, a strip of burlap useless for heat but comforting in its weight. The fabric smells faintly of smoke and animal grease. You stopped noticing weeks ago, but if someone from back east walked in, they'd likely assume you were preserving bacon in your sleep. Each layer tells a story: the faded blue from an old work shirt, the floral print from your mother's dress that tore on the wagon trail,
Oh.
a scrap of flour sack that once held the only luxury you had, sugar. Pioneers didn't throw fabric away. Nothing was ever to worn. It was just reassigned. A sleeve became a patch became a quilt square, a quilt became a blanket. Eventually, when all else failed, it became kindling. Life on the frontier was one long chain of repurposing. Even comfort required recycling. You shift a little, and the patchwork quilt sighs. It's heavier than you remember, but weight was part of the design. A thick quilt pinned you down in place, which helped in 2 ways. It trapped warmth and prevented you from unconsciously moving toward the cold spots on the bed. Congratulations, your blanket also doubles as a sleep restraint. Beneath the blanket, you're still dressed from head to toe. Pajamas weren't a thing here. They were a fantasy belonging to people with servants and stoves that stayed lit all night. You sleep in your day clothes, socks, and occasionally your hat. If it's a particularly brutal night, you add your coat. In your boots. There's no rule against sleeping in your boots when frostbite is on the line. Sometimes, just before drifting off, you imagine what soft, down-filled comforters must feel like. Maybe the folks in the east sleep under feathers, warm as toast, dreaming of new beginnings out west. You'd trade them places in a heartbeat. They'd change their minds after one night here. Still, there's something comforting about the weight of the quilt. It's a handmade promise that someone, at some point, cared enough to keep you alive. Each crooked stitch is a small act of defiance against the cold. Some were sewn by lamplight, with fingers so numb they could barely hold a needle. Others by children learning their first practical skills, survival, disguised as art. You run your hand over the uneven texture. Quilts weren't just useful. They were stories in cloth. Women on the frontier stitched together entire family histories without a single written word. A patch from a wedding dress, a piece of a child's worn-out trousers, a faded bit of calico from a dress that had once been bright. In towns where paper was scarce, quilts were journals that happened to be warm. But no matter how many layers you pile on, there's always that faint draft crawling across your face. The cold that refuses to be ignored. You pull the covers tighter, creating a small tent of breath and heat. The air inside becomes humid, your eyelashes damp with condensation. You've built your own microclimaton, comfortable, but survivable. You think briefly of the people worse off, cowboys sleeping under their saddles, drifters curled up in barns, families with more children than blankets, some shared coverings that could barely cover a single adult, tucking in their feet and hoping the rest of their body forgave them. Parents would often sleep on the outer edges, acting as human insulation for their children in the middle. Practical, yes. Noble, maybe. Comfortable, not remotely. Your mind drifts to town gossips. Someone mentioned a new store down the trail that's selling factory-made blankets. Woven tight, smoother than anything made by hand. It costs more than you can afford, of course. But the idea of something machine-perfect feels almost alien. You wonder if warmth made by a factory feels different. Colder, maybe, in spirit. The quilt shifts again as you exhale. The pattern doesn't match, but that's part of its charm. A kaleidoscope of necessity. Stare at it, tracing the seams in the faint morning light. You notice one patch that docenti belonga, square of red flannel stitched awkwardly among browns and grays. A bright mistake, or a deliberate spark? Hard to say. Maybe someone wanted to remind you that color exists, even in a world of frost. You reach for the edge of the blanket, feeling the rough edge where it's fraying. The thread gives a little. You tell yourself you'll mend it later, though you probably won't. The cold doesn't wait for repairs. You can hear the wind again, testing the seams of the cabin. The blanket shifts slightly with each gust, like a flag surrendering to nature. You sigh and pull it close one last time before gathering the will to rise. Soon, you'll step into the chill, add another log to the fire, and start your morning. The quilt will hang by the wall, still damp from breath, still smelling of wood smoke. You'll pat it once in passing, grateful for its quiet service. And when night returns, you'll repeat the ritual layer. Cocoon, breathe, endure. It's not luxurious, but it's honest warmth. Still, as your hands brush against the rough fabric, you think about how fragile that warmth really is. While a single spark could undo all of it, the fire that keeps you alive is also the fire that could take everything. The stove is more than furniture, it's a fragile iron god. A squat, soot-streaked altar that decides whether you live comfortably tonight or spend it rehearsing frostbite. You sit before it like a worshiper, hunched and reverent, feeding it scraps of wood with the care of someone hand-feeding a bear. The stove gives everything, heat, light, the illusion of control. But it also takes everything in its own time. It eats through your woodpile faster than you'd like, and it always demands attention. You can't just fall asleep and trust it to behave. You have to bank the fire, a phrase that sounds cozy, until you realize it means packing the coals under ash, trying to keep them alive just enough to rekindle at dawn. It's a delicate art, halfway between cooking and gambling. You crouch close, face glowing red in the dim light. The flames move like thoughts, quick, unpredictable, beautiful but untrustworthy. The metal walls of the stove cracked as they expand, a sound halfway between applause and warning. A faint smell of iron, ash, and pine sap fills the cabin. It's the smell of winter survival, as familiar as your own breath. You listen to the wood pop and settle. Each snap makes you flinch a little, remembering all the stories. A spark landing on a blanket, a log rolling loose, a house gone by morning. Fire doesn't need malice to be cruel, just needs opportunity. Here opportunity is everywhere, dry boards, old quilts, carelessness born of exhaustion. Still you can't help admiring it. The way the light flickers across the cabin walls, warm and golden, turning every crack and knot into a tiny universe. The stove paints everything in motion, shadows lengthening, shrinking, stretching like lazy animals. The rough-hewn furniture takes on an almost gentle personality in the glow. Even the frost on the window looks less like a threat and more like a decoration lace spun by a patient ghost. You poke the coals with a piece of iron that used to be part of a wagon wheel. Tools out here tend to live many lives. The fire responds with a hiss, brightening for a moment before calming back down. You feel its warmth on your face and almost forget how cold your back still is. That's the stove's favorite trick: comfort in half doses. It promises enough warmth to stay close, never enough to leave. Sometimes, when the night is very long, you talk to the stove without realizing it. Not with words exactly, but with gestures: adding a log, shifting the door, adjusting the damper. It becomes a kind of conversation. You give, it responds. It hums when content, growls when hungry. The relationship is intimate in the strangest way. You know its moods, its habits. It's the exact tone it makes before the smoke tries to backdraft through the chimney and fill your room with regret. There are people in town, blacksmiths mostly, who say they can tell a person's character by how they tend to fire. Too cautious, and you freeze. Too careless, and you burn. The sweet spot, they say, is patience, steady, practiced watchfulness. You like to think you found that balance, though you still keep a bucket of snow by the door, just in case patience fails. You lean closer, watching the flames curl around the logs like ribbons. Firelight, for all its danger, is hypnotic. It's easy to see why people have stared into it for thousands of years. Seeing everything from gods to futures to old memories inside the shifting glow. Out here, where the night is endless and the stars feel unreachable, the fire becomes the only company that moves. You think about how the pioneers before you must have done the same. How many nights they sat just like this, faces lit orange, eyes half closed, minds wandering toward home or heaven. The fire was the first storyteller of the frontier. It danced, it cracked, it whispered. Its rhythm was enough to lull the tired to sleep, even when the wind clawed at the door. But there's always that moment before sleep when trust wavers. You open your eyes just to make sure the fire hasn't grown greedy. You check the distance between the stove and your blanket. You eye that small pile of kindling too close to the hearth and shift it back with your foot. Every frontier death story begins with someone thinking, "It's probably fine." You refuse to star in that version. Sometimes when you're not alone, the nightly ritual becomes a group effort. One person stirs the coals, another folds up their coat to block the draft under the door. A third mutters advice no one asked for. Then everyone sits back in silence, the fire snapping softly, eyes reflecting orange. It's a moment of rare communion, people, in flame and fear, coexisting peacefully for a few hours. Eventually, the warmth reaches the far corners of the room, and the edge of the cold dulls. You stretch out again, quilts rustling, and let your gaze linger on the glow slipping through the stove's vents. It flickers gently like an eyelid half closing. You can almost hear it breathe. Sleep doesn't come quickly, not yet, but comfort does. You lie still, one hand outside the blanket, feeling the faint waves of heat radiate across the room. It's uneven, but you've learned to take what you can get. The stove groans as it cools. Single spark escapes the vent, spins lazily through the air, and dies before reaching the floor. You watch it go, a tiny firefly born and gone in a breath. The danger is always there, but so is the beauty. Survival, you realize, has always been about managing both. You close your eyes again, the warmth fading slowly against your skin. The crackling softens to a whisper, blending with the sigh of wind outside. The night grows still, the cabin settling into its old rhythm of wood, wind, and quiet gratitude. When you finally drift off, the fire still glows faintly in the stove banked, but alive. It will wait for morning, patient and re-dyed. And when you wake to your own breath hanging like mist in the air, you'll see that the warmth you fought to keep has fled again, leaving behind only frost and memory. You wake to your own breath hanging in the air, like a ghost that hasn't decided whether to leave yet. It curls upward in lazy swirls, catching the faint morning light sneaking through a crack in the shutter. For a moment, it's almost pretty. Then the cold hits again, and beauty becomes a luxury you can't afford. Breath is everywhere on the windows, in the rafters, even frozen along the edge of your blanket where you exhaled through the night. Sleeping in the Wild West during winter wasn't just a matter of staying warm. It was about learning to live inside your own weather system. You, your breath, and the frost all shared the same small world. You pull the blanket closer, but the air bites anyway. Your nose tingles. Your eyelashes stick together. The wooden boards beneath you might as well be a glacier, and every move sends a shiver racing from your toes to your scalp. If comfort were a creature, It left the cabin hours ago. What's left is you, cocooned in layers of wool, cotton, and sheer determination. Out here, warmth is a puzzle you solve every night. The trick isn't just the blanket, it's how you sleep under it. The old-timers would tell you, sleep with your hat on, your socks dry, your mouth closed unless you like waking up with ice on your mustache. Sometimes people even pulled the blanket over their heads, creating a tiny, humid world powered by nothing but breath. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Congratulations, you've invented the human terrarium. Inside that little tent of fabric and fog, time feels strange. You hear your own breathing echoing softly. You smell the faint dampness of wool and the smoky residue of the fire you nursed to life hours before. The world beyond your blanket fades away, and all that's left is rhythm, the inhale, the exhale, the quiet sigh of a body refusing to freeze. If you're lucky, someone else is sleeping beside you. In the West, sharing heat wasn't romance, it was logistics. Families slept shoulder to shoulder, friends shared bunks, travelers layered like books in a shelf. It wasn't unusual to wake up with someone's elbow in your ribs and think, good, at least they're still warm. The communal breath in a small cabin could lift the temperature just enough to keep everyone alive. Each exhale was a small contribution to survival, an invisible kind of teamwork. But there's a darkly funny truth about sleeping in layers of breath. Everything gets damp, the blankets, the floorboards, even your hair. The cold air outside the blanket meets your humid little pocket of warmth, and suddenly, you're wrapped in the world's saddest rain cloud. You might wake up feeling warmer but smell vaguely like steamed laundry that's been forgotten overnight. Still, it's better than the alternative. You've seen what happens when people underestimate the night. They go to bed with only one blanket, maybe too tired to restoke the fire. By morning, their boots are stiff with ice, and their breath is turned to frost lace on the inside of the windows. The air feels so sharp, you could chip it with a knife. That's when you understand your breath is the only proof that the cold hasn't won. You sit up and watch it drift again, silver and soft, vanishing just before it touches the rafters. Each puff feels fragile, like a tiny offering to the morning. The light outside is weak and blue, and the frost on the glass has grown thick enough to sculpt. You could almost carve a pattern in it if your fingers weren't busy refusing to move. Some nights, when the fire was too far gone to save, people used to turn to clever tricks. A hot brick wrapped in cloth, slipped under the blanket. A copper pan of coals placed carefully at the foot of the bed, though carefully is doing a lot of work there. Many a bedspread met its end that way. Still, desperate times called for inventive bedtime pyrotechnics. The wealthy had feather beds, the poor had straw ticks, and everyone, regardless of class, had breath. Even in fine parlors, frost crept down the windows like slow ivy. Guests would wake to find ice edging the wash basin, and their breath painting the air above them like candle smoke. The difference between luxury and hardship was often just a thicker quilt and fewer rats. You glanced toward the stove. The coals are nothing but a faint red glow now, like the heartbeat of the room refusing to stop. You'll have to coax it back to life, soon feed it kindling, fan the embers, pretend you know what you're doing. But for now, you lie back and let your breath fill the space again. Each exhale feels like a small act of ownership. The cold can have the walls, the floor, the door butt, not the air between you and the ceiling. That's still yours. There's a certain peace in the quiet that follows. The kind of peace that only comes when all motion has slowed, when even the wind outside has given up trying to sneak in. The stillness is absolute, except for that faint rhythm of breath, rising and falling. You listen to it until it becomes something like music. And as you drift, half awake, half dreaming, you realize that this ritual, this nightly dance of breath and frost, isn't just survival. It's the West itself distilled, fragile, stubborn, endlessly human. Tomorrow, you'll wake again to the sound of wood splitting, the scrape of a shovel in the snow, the crack of the stove being fed. But for now, you float in that cold, slow world of breath and blankets. The frost will melt by noon, only to return by dusk. The cycle repeats, as it always does. And when the night creeps in again, you'll find yourself layering the same way blankets. Clothes, courage, and finally, that invisible warmth you make yourself. 'Cause out here, your breath isn't just air. It's proof you're still part of the living. You'd think a bed is a bed. It's a soft, inviting sanctuary where your tired body can surrender to the night. But in the Wild West, especially during those frostbitten winters, your bed was less of a sanctuary and more of a carefully managed truce between you, nature, and whatever decided to live in the straw with you. Your beds weren't bought so much as assembled. The idea of a mattress from a store was about as distant as a trip to Paris. You started with a wooden frame if you were lucky enough to have one. Maybe some rough-hewn planks or rope webbing stretched tight across a simple box frame. Over that went a sack, usually burlap or coarse ticking, stuffed with whatever you had on hand. Straw was the most common choice. Feathers, if you had a generous flock and a forgiving conscience. Corn husks, dry grasses, pine needles, or even moss in a pinch. Each material came with its own personality. Straw, for example, started off golden, springy, and faintly fragrant, like sleeping on a meadow that had agreed to behave for a few nights. But give it time. After a few weeks of rolling, breathing, sweating, and turning, it lost its charm. It flattened, poked, and took on an aroma that could be politely described as well lived in. That's when you'd drag the ticking outside, shake it out, and hope the wind carried away the evidence. Feather beds were the dream, quite literally. They were soft, warm, and forgiving, though they did have the tendency to migrate. One moment you'd be sinking into a cloud, the next, the feathers had all fled to the edges, leaving you marooned on the fabric's bony middle. Still, it beats sleeping on the frozen earth or the boards that might as well have been. But for every benefit of feathers came a curse: upkeep. Feathers had a way of escaping through the seams, so most mornings began with a small blizzard as you fluffed and restuffed your bedding. It looked a little like a pillow fight that only one side participated in. Sometimes the feathers even carried their own faint, lingering barnyard perfume, a reminder that comfort always came with a bit of compromise. And then, of course, there were the uninvited guests. Mice loved straw ticks. To them, you weren't so much a sleeper as an upstairs neighbor. The warmth, the seeds hidden in the straw, the crumbs from your bedtime biscuit, it was paradise. You might feel them scurry during the night, their tiny feet tracing little cold lines beneath you. Some folks got used to it, the same way one gets used to the sound of wind or creaking boards. Others waged quiet wars, setting traps, tucking cats at the foot of the bed, or hanging the mattress from rafters during the day to shake out the freeloaders. Feather beds had their own risks. Ever pluck a chicken that wasn't quite done being a chicken? Sometimes the smell followed you home. It wasn't uncommon for people to air out their bedding, regularly hoisting the sacks onto fence posts to let the sun and wind do their quiet work. On the right day, a frontier town might look like a strange parade of puffed-up bedding, flapping in the cold breeze. Everyone's private comfort suddenly public. Even the straw itself was seasonal. Fresh straw was often gathered after the harvest, dried and stored for this exact purpose. Replacing your mattress stuffing became a winter ritual of its own. You'd take the old straw out, shake the dust loose, maybe use the leftovers for kindling, and refill your ticking with crisp new stalks. For a few nights, the bed would feel almost luxurious, again crunchy, fragrant, even clean. You'd fall asleep to the faint scent of summer hayfields, which was as close to warmth as the imagination could offer in January. Some beds were communal affairs, shared between partners, siblings, or sometimes entire families stacked, like sardines, in pursuit of warmth. Privacy was a myth, comfort was collective. And when someone rolled over too far and fell out, it was just part of the nightly choreography. If a child cried in the cold, someone would murmur, pull them closer, and the mass of blankets, straw, and breathing bodies would settle again, like a living quilt. You might think all this discomfort would make people bitter, but there was a strange pride in it. A well-stuffed straw tick was a mark of domestic triumph. It meant you'd harvested enough, stored enough, worked enough. It meant you were surviving. Visitors might even comment on it. "Good firm bed you've got there," they'd say, as if firmness were the very measure of civilization. Over time, your back would memorize the shape of your bed, the soft dips, the sharp stalks, the tiny squeak of straw adjusting beneath you. You learned which side of the bed had the least lumps, how to curl just so to avoid a persistent twig, and when to surrender to the rhythm of it all. After a few nights, even the occasional mouse stopped being an alarm and started being a fact of life. You, the straw, and the night learned to coexist. And when dawn came, with its pale light and icy breath, you'd rise and see your bed looking like a field after a windstorm, flattened, tangled, and faintly steaming from your body heat. You'd smooth it out, pat it down, maybe whisper a quiet thank you to the unseen farmhands and the feathered contributors who made it possible. Because for all its flaws, that strange bundle of straw and fabric was your island in a sea of cold. It cradled you through blizzards, storms, and nights when even the stars seemed frozen. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't clean. But it was home. It's the middle of the night again, and the wind outside sounds like it's trying to file a complaint with the door. You can hear it in the boards, every groan of timber, every whisper through a crack feels personal. And then you remember that old saying from the prairies, "Cow gives more than milk, she gives heat," which is how you find yourself sleeping just a few feet from one. Out here in the Wild West, the line between a home and a barn was often more of a polite suggestion than a hard rule. If the night promised to drop below freezing, and it usually did, you learned to take warmth wherever you could find it. For many settlers, that meant bunking up in the same space as their animals. Horses, cows, goats, sheep, they weren't just livestock. They were central heating with hooves. At first, it sounds odd. Sharing a room with a cow isn't most people's idea of comfort. But after you've spent a few winters fighting drafts that seem to come from every direction, you start to think practically. A single cow produces a surprising amount of body heat, enough to keep a small barn a few degrees warmer than the icy air outside. A few cows? That's practically a sauna if you ignore the smell. So you spread your straw, take a safe distance from the stall, wrap yourself in your patchwork quilts, and settle in. The air is warm in a way that feels earned. It's earthy, heavy, alive. You hear the slow, rhythmic chewing of a cow grinding cud, the soft huff of a horse adjusting its weight, the occasional sheep bleating in its sleep. It's not silence, but it's company. In a landscape that could swallow sound and hope alike, that kind of company mattered. The smells are ... complex, a mix of hay, damp wood, leather, and the unmistakable musk of animal life. You get used to it faster than you'd expect. After all, survival has a way of editing your sense of disgust. When your nose and your toes are at odds, the toes usually win. Many settlers even built hybrid structures called house barns or living barns, a single building with one half for humans and the other for animals. Separated only by a wooden partition, or sometimes just a hanging quilt. It wasn't just practical. It was efficient. Your cows slept next to you, your chickens underfoot, and your pigs if you were bold snoring somewhere near the hearth. Every breath, every puff of animal warmth helped keep frost from claiming the night. The first few nights you probably lie awake, uneasy about it all. The cows shuffle. The horse exhales through its nose with an impressive snort. Something in the corner creaks. Then, gradually, the rhythm of it starts to soothe you. The livestock fall into their own sleepy cadence, and you drift in sync with them, warm, alive, and oddly grateful. There was something almost poetic about it, though no one at the time would have used that word. Humans and animals sharing the same air, the same cold, the same stubborn will to see the sunrise. You might even reach out in the night to touch the rough flank of your favorite cow, just to make sure she's still breathing, and by extension, so are you. Sometimes, during the fiercest storms, whole families moved into the barn entirely. It wasn't exactly glamorous. Snow would pile high against the doors, and the air would grow thick and humid from all the breathing bodies. But the alternative, freezing alone in the cabin as the fire sputtered out, was far worse. Out here, dignity was a negotiable thing. Warmth was not. Of course, there were drawbacks. Chickens could be alarm clocks with no snooze button, and roosters had an irritating habit of declaring dawn at wildly inaccurate hours. A restless horse could shake the whole structure, and a cow deciding to stand suddenly might knock over the lantern. You learned to move carefully and keep anything flammable well out of reach. Still, there was something profoundly comforting about that shared life. The animals' breath created a fog that mingled with your own, and the steady thrum of their hearts felt like a lullaby. It wasn't luxury, it was community, the kind forged not from choice, but from necessity. Sometimes, when the snow outside howled so fiercely that even the stars disappeared, people would say it felt as though the whole world had been reduced to this. The warmth of animals, the sound of breathing, the faint glow of lantern light. Beyond that, There was only darkness and cold, vast, endless, and waiting. And yet, within these humble walls, life carried on. Calves were born in winter, kittens mewed from haylofts, and people dreamed their small, exhausted dreams beside them. Maybe you dreamed, too, of spring, of sunlight, of a night when you could sleep without the sound of hooves and snorts for company. But deep down, you knew that come morning, when the frost glistened on the door hinges and your breath fogged the air, you'd still whisper a quiet thank you to the creatures who'd kept you alive. Because out here, survival was never solitary. It was always shared between human and beast, warmth and will. By the time you've trudged through snow for days, your boots stiff with ice, and your fingers beginning to question your life choices, the sight of a lighted window in town feels like salvation. Maybe it's Dodge City. Maybe it's a mining town with more dust than dignity. But there it is, a sign swinging faintly in the wind, promising rooms for rent and warm beds. You push through the door, half frozen, half hopeful. The boarding house is small, but smells promising wood smoke, stew, and humanity in varying stages of cleanliness. There's a fire flickering in the hearth, a cat asleep in front of it, and a landlady who looks like she's seen it all. You pay a few coins, sign your name with fingers that barely bend, and she nods toward the stairs. "Third room on the right," she says. "Mind the drafts and don't feed the rats." Congratulations, you. VA made it to one of the great social hubs of the Wild West, the boarding house bed. Upstairs, the hallway creaks like an old fiddle. Every board complains as you pass. The room she's given you is small enough that turning around feels like a choreographed dance. There's a narrow bed, a chipped basin, and a single window that can't decide whether it's more whole or glass. You can see your breath before you even take off your coat, still compared to the wagon or the barn, or that time you slept under an overturned sled. This feels like the Ritz. The bed itself is an adventure. Its frame wobbles when you look at it too hard, and the straw tick dips in the middle like it's waiting to swallow you whole. You sit down, and the whole structure emits a long, tired sigh, as if the ghosts of previous occupants are protesting your arrival, and there were many of them. Boarding house beds were communal survivors, rarely new and never alone. They'd supported cowhands, miners, traveling salesmen, widows, newlyweds, and the occasional fugitive between situations. You could trace their history by the creaks and stains if you had the stomach for it. Every lump was a story. Every squeak, an echo of someone else's restless night. The blanket smells faintly of lard soap and older times, the pillow of dreams long expired. You pull back the covers and hesitate. Something scurries, probably just a memory, you tell yourself. But you still shake the bedding out, because out here probably isn't good enough. If the landlady was generous or fond of you, you might get a hot brick to tuck at your feet. More likely, you will find an old wool quilt patched so many times it's less blanket and more historical document. The designs tell their own tales, faded florals from back east, stitched squares of worn work shirts, a bit of flannel from someone's long-lost coat. You wrap yourself in it and feel the weight not just of the fabric, but of the hundreds of people who did the same before you. Privacy, of course, was optional. The walls were thin, and your neighbors were close enough that you might learn more about their digestive health than you. Dee ever wanted to know. You hear coughing, a harmonica, someone laughing softly to themselves, and inevitably someone snoring with conviction. If you were lucky, you got the room to yourself. If you weren't, well, the term boarding bed wasn't always metaphorical. It wasn't uncommon for two strangers to share a bed, especially in crowded towns during winter. The landlady would simply nod and say, "He's clean," as though that settled the matter. You'd both lie down stiff as planks, facing opposite directions, and spend the night pretending that personal space was a thing of the future. Still, there was comfort in it. The sound of other humans breathing nearby was strangely reassuring. It made the night feel smaller, safer, out there in the dark beyond the town limits. Cold could kill you, and silence could drive you mad. Here, surrounded by snores and laughter and creaking floors, you felt part of something, an improvised, temporary tribe of survivors. The boarding house wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a social crossroad. In the morning, everyone gathered around the stove, clutching tin mugs of weak coffee and swapping stories. You'd hear about gold strikes, broken wagons, gunfights, lost loves, and impossible dreams. The night's discomforts melted into a kind of communal warmth, one born not from luxury, but from shared endurance. And that's the secret charm of these shabby rooms. No matter how scratchy the blankets, how uneven the mattress, or how persistent the smell of cabbage stew, they offered something rarer than comfort continuity. You lay down where others had laid before, breathed the same cold air, stared at the same ceiling cracks. The past didn't feel distant here. It was snoring beside you. Eventually, you drift off. The bed creaks, the floor shifts, the wind sighs through the window pane. Somewhere downstairs, the landlady is banking the fire. The cat stirs, and for one long, merciful stretch of hours, the world holds still. If there was one place in any Wild West town that refused to let winter ruin a good time, it was the saloon. Its doors might swing open to let in icy wind and half-frozen travelers, but inside, the air was alive thick with smoke. Laughter, the clatter of cards, and the hopeful tune of an out-toned piano that hadn't seen a tuner since the Mexican-American War. You could spot the saloon from halfway down the main street, light spilling out through the frosted windows. Music weaving between the sounds of spurs, boots, and raised voices. The air inside hit you like a physical thing, warm, heavy, and smelling of whiskey, tobacco, and wet wool. Men crowded near the stove, holding their hands out like pilgrims to a sacred flame. Someone was telling a story louder than necessary. Someone else was losing at poker faster than they could drink, and in the corner a woman with a feather in her hair was singing a song that made even the most hardened cowboy stare into his glass a little too long. For a few blessed hours, the saloon made you forget the cold. Whiskey was warmth you could swallow, and laughter was insulation enough to survive another night. The stories grew taller, the bets larger, and the sense of time began to slip away. Outside, the snow kept falling softly, silently, uncaring. But inside, the night roared with life. Some men came for the drink, others for company, and a few for the simple comfort of being among other souls who hadn't yet frozen or gone mad. The saloon keeper knew this. He stoked the fire, poured generously, and made sure that even when tempers flared or a fight broke out, as they often did, the warmth of the place somehow survived. But eventually, the lamps dimmed, the piano player yawned, and reality crept back in.
One by one,
The patrons pulled on their coats, muttered their goodbyes, and stepped out into the kind of cold that made you instantly regret every decision that brought you there. The first breath outside was always a shock.
ow,
The warmth vanished in seconds. The world beyond the swinging doors was a frozen stillness so complete it felt like stepping into another realm. The snow reflected what little moonlight there was, casting the empty street in ghostly blue. Your boots crunched, and your breath turned to clouds. The walk home, if you were sober enough to remember where home was an ordeal of willpower and balance. The whiskey in your veins made you feel invincible, but your body disagreed. The cold seeped through wool, leather, and bravado alike. Every gust of wind was a knife. The saloon's laughter seemed impossibly far away, a memory fading faster than the footprints behind you. Past the silent livery stable, past the frozen trough, past the shuttered storefronts that looked like they'd gone to sleep for the season. Every few steps you'd glance at the dim glow of your breath and imagine it was smoke from some faraway fire. If luck was with you, you made it back to your boarding house or your shack or your tent before your fingers turned to ice. If not, you might spend the night in the barn, curled against a horse for warmth, or huddled behind a stack of firewood trying to convince yourself you were comfortable. Some didn't make it home at all. The local papers told quiet stories about drifters found in the morning, half buried in snow, still clutching their coats closed. They were mourned briefly and remembered vaguely. Out here, death by cold wasn't dramatic. It was simply winter being itself. But for most, that walk through the frozen dark became part of a ritual. It was the price of the night's brief escape, the penance for warmth borrowed rather than earned. They'd stumble into bed, boots still on, face numb, and drift into uneasy dreams filled with laughter, smoke, and the sound of piano keys echoing down empty streets. By dawn, the saloon would be ready again. The stove lit, the cards shuffled, the whiskey poured, and the cycle would begin, a new firelight, frost, and fragile warmth repeating like a heartbeat in the wilderness. Still, there were those who couldn't afford even a night of whiskey and music. In a world without central heating, electric lights, or the comforting hum of a radiator. Bedtime wasn't just about crawling under the covers, it was an act of preparation, a nightly campaign against discomfort and the unpredictable. Before you could surrender to sleep, you had to make peace with the cold, the dark, and your own wandering thoughts. You begin by banking the fire. The glow has dimmed to dull orange coals, and you crouch beside it, coaxing it with a few final pieces of wood, hoping they'll last until morning. The sound of crackling embers fills the small room, each pop and hiss reminding you how fragile warmth really is. The smell of smoke clings to everything: your clothes, your hair, your breath, but you hardly notice anymore. It's the scent of survival. Then comes the ritual of inspection, checking the door latch, securing the shutters, and making sure the draft hasn't found a new way in. The wind outside moans against the walls, sounding for all the world like someone lost out there, calling faintly for help. You try not to think about it. You've heard enough stories of travelers who ignored such cries and never came back. The frontier has a way of blurring the line between superstition and wisdom. A quick glance at your boots by the hearth because waking to frozen leather is no way to start the day. Then you peel off your outer layers, muttering about how the cold bites harder at night, even indoors. Your hands are stiff, your breath fogs the air, and you move faster than usual, eager to slip beneath whatever pile of quilts, blankets, and hides you can claim as your fortress. Before lying down, though, there's one last habit, part faith, part fear. You murmur a few words, maybe a prayer, maybe just a whisper to no one in particular. Keep the fire lit, keep the roof standing, keep me breathing come morning. Some nights you mean it. Some nights you just say it because your parents did and their parents before them. Out here where the stars are sharp as ice and the silence is deep enough to swallow you, even the unbelievers mutter something before sleep. They've seen too much not to. The West has its own kind of religion, less about salvation. It's more about getting through the night without freezing or being eaten by something that howls. Once in bed, you pull the covers up to your chin and curl tight, a cocoon of fabric and determination. You can hear the faint noises of the night, the creak of the cabin settling, the soft rustle of a mouse in the corner, the wind threading through the cracks. The soundscape of frontier slumber is never truly silent. If you're lucky enough to share the bed, you and your partner are pressed so close you can't tell whose elbow is whose. Body heat becomes communal property, shared like the last candle in a long, dark vigil. The rhythm of another person's breathing is oddly comforting. It's proof that someone else made it this far too. But sleep doesn't come easy. The mind wanders, 2 debts unpaid, letters unsent, and the haunting question of whether this frozen patch of land will ever feel like home. You think of the neighbors you haven't seen since the last thaw, animals that didn't survive the last storm, and the endless stretch of wilderness beyond your walls. Sometimes you dream before you even drift off, half-waking visions of spring, of green grass and warm sun, of a world that feels impossibly distant. Other nights, you stay awake long enough to see the fire sink lower, shadows stretching across the room like slow-moving ghosts. When you finally do sleep, it's a shallow, watchful kind. The body rests, but the mind keeps one ear open for trouble.
Out here.
You learn to dream with caution.
Us.
You dream in layers, the way you sleep in case something cold, real, or clawed interrupts. By morning, if the roof still holds and your breath hasn't turned to ice, you'll sit up, stretch stiff limbs, and give a small, grateful sigh. Another night survived, another victory over the season and your own doubt. You'll shake out the blankets, stoke the fire, and start again. Winter nights on the frontier were long, and prayers, restless or otherwise, were cheap insurance. They couldn't stop the cold, but sometimes they made you feel just brave enough to face it. You don't so much sleep through the night as negotiate with it. The West doesn't believe in long unbroken rest, not when coyotes prowl, wind howls, and the logs in the stove groan like something alive. Tonight, as always, someone must keep watch. Maybe that someone is you. The fire's soft light flickers against the rough-hewn walls, and your breath curls in the air like small ghosts. Everyone else in the cabin is asleep or pretending to be. You pull the blanket tighter around your shoulders, sit by the fading coals, and listen. There's always listening. The faint hum of the wind slipping through the cracks, the groan of the roof beam adjusting to the cold, the soft rhythmic snore from the next cot. It's just the kind of soundscape that could lull you to sleep. Weren't such a risk. shift on your stool, poking at the embers with a stick. Sparks flare briefly like tiny rebellions against the night, then fade back into dull orange. You resist the temptation to add more wood. Firewood burns fast and cuts slow, and every piece you use now is one you'll wish you had at dawn. The trick is to keep it alive, not blazing, like a secret or a stubborn hope. Time moves differently when you're the only one awake. Minutes stretch like old leather. You find yourself thinking strange thoughts about how the same stars above your roof are shining over cities you'll never see, or how the crackle of your fire might sound to a wolf on the ridge. You think of home, if you had one before this. Maybe a farmhouse back east, or just the idea of it a place where the cold wasn't quite so personal. Then something stirs outside. You freeze. Not the wind, not quite. Scrape, a muffled thud, the whisper of snow shifting underweight. You lean forward, straining to hear. Your heartbeat feels louder than the sound itself. It's probably just a branch, you tell yourself. Probably this is how the long watch works. Alternating between calm and alert. Boredom and panic, warmth and the suspicion that warmth makes you soft. You look at the door, the latch sturdy, but not unbreakable. The rifle leans nearby, close enough to grab, but far enough away to pretend you're not thinking about it. You imagine the things that might be out there: a fox nosing through your scraps, a coyote calling for its mate, or something larger, less polite. To distract yourself, you talk quietly to the fire, as if it's an old friend who's also trapped here. "Don't die on me," you murmur, feeding it a splinter of pine. It answers with a hiss and a curl of smoke. The room fills with that bittersweet scent: resin, char, a trace of sap. The smell of every western night, really. Sometimes when the cold deepens, you pace the room to stay awake. Now the floorboards creak in rhythm to your steps, and you imagine them whispering. Still here? Still here. You envy the sleepers, but not enough to join them. Someone has to make sure the dawn arrives. Hours pass this wayfire tending, listening, thinking too much. Outside, the moon drifts lower, and frost feathers the inside of the window pane. You trace the patterns absent-mindedly, pretending you can read the sky like a clock. You can't, but you can tell by the faint paling at the edge of the horizon that morning is coming, slow as forgiveness. When your shift is finally done, you nudge the next person awake. They grumble, blink blearily, and wrap themselves in their coat. You trade a few words, half complaint, half blessing, and crawl into bed. The mattress feels like heaven, even if it's just straw in a sack. As you sink into that heavy, earned sleep, the sounds of the new watch begin. The soft scrape of boots, the crack of a log shifting in the fire, the whisper of breath against cold air. You smile faintly, knowing someone else is listening now, watching the same shadows you just survived. The long night watch is the price of safety here. Not everyone pays it willingly, but everyone owes it eventually. And as you drift off, the last thing you hear is that low, steady fire, your small, flickering ally, in a world too vast for comfort. Soon enough, the light will grow stronger, and morning will come with all its cold duties. But for now, you sleep deeply, knowing the frontier doesn't rest it, just takes turns pretending to. When sleep finally comes on the frontier, it isn't the peaceful, weightless kind you remember from childhood. It's heavier, layered, and full of echoes, like a quilt stitched from every place you've ever left behind. Out here under the moan of winter wind and the slow burn of dying embers, you don't just sleep, you drift backward in time. It's the first thing you notice in your dreams is the warmth. Not the brittle heat of a frontier fire, but the soft, even warmth of remembered rooms. In your mind, you're back east store, wherever home once was. The air doesn't smell of smoke and damp wool, but of bread baking, soap drying on a line, maybe even lilacs if you were lucky enough to have a garden. The floors don't creak, the windows hold. The night feels safe. You remember the texture of your old quilt, the sound of rain on the roof, the murmur of familiar voices drifting from the next room. Dreams like these arrive without invitation and leave before you can hold on to them. But they're comforting while they last. You might see your mother tending the fire in that gentle, practiced way, or your father leaning in the doorway, pipe in hand, looking as though the world beyond the porch didn't yet belong to you. The longer you're out here, the more vivid those details become, not faded by distance, but sharpened by longing. You dream of the small things: a kettle steaming on the hearth, the creak of a rocking chair, the way the morning light once fell across the kitchen floor. They say memory sweetens with distance, and maybe that's true. But you conveniently forget the leaky roof, the chores, the crowded rooms. In sleep, everything back home has been quietly perfected. Sometimes, though, the dreams turn strange. You're back in your old bed, but the house feels too quiet, too still. When you step into the hallway, you can't find the door that leads outside. The wallpaper curls like bark, the windows are frozen over, and you realize your old home has been swallowed by the same winter that surrounds you now. Dreams have a cruel sense of humor. That way they offer comfort just long enough to remind you what's gone. You wake briefly, half aware, the blanket tangled around your legs, your breath misting in the chill. For a few seconds, you're disoriented and sure which world is real. The dream one feels softer, safer. The real one, heavier, draftier, but somehow more honest. You roll over, tug the covers close, and drift again, hoping to return to where the walls were thicker and your bones didn't ache so much. Others dream too, around campfires or in bunkhouses. Men mutter in their sleep, whispering names of towns and people the others don't recognize. One man says his mother's name every night before dawn, his voice barely audible. Another murmurs street directions as if he, still trying to find his way back through a city that no longer wants him. Even the toughest ranch hands and trappers carry pieces of their old lives into these frozen dreams. Dreams become a kind of shared language. Over morning coffee, when the steam curls and fingers thaw, you sometimes talk about them, the strange, vivid journeys of the night before. You describe the smell of your childhood kitchen, the warmth of your sister's laughter, the way your old dog used to curl at your feet. Others nod, listening closely as if your dream might remind them of something they've lost to. Because out here, nostalgia isn't a luxury, it's a survival tool. It reminds you why you keep going. When the nights stretch long and the stars seem too far away, remembering that you once belonged somewhere helps. Even if you can never go back, the memory burns warmer than the fire. Sometimes when you wake before dawn and stare at the ceiling beams glimmering faintly with frost, you wonder what they're dreaming about back east. Do they still think of you? Do they imagine you in some golden frontier, all freedom and adventure? You almost want to laugh. If only they knew the truth, that the adventure mostly consists of keeping your toes attached through February. Still, you don't begrudge them their illusions. You had them once too. And in a way, dreams are just another form of travel, the only kind that doesn't require boots, horses, or a thawed river. When morning finally arrives, gray and reluctant, you wake to the smell of smoke and the sound of someone stirring the fire. You stretch, rub your eyes, and smile faintly. The dream slips away like breath on glass, but its warmth lingers. It always does. Children somehow make the cold less cruel. Maybe it's because they treat it as a challenge instead of a sentence, a sort of ongoing contest between stubbornness and frost. In the Wild West, where even grown men sometimes woke up wondering if they'd frozen solid in their sleep, the children seemed to invent warmth out of thin air, laughter, and questionable decisions. You might wake one morning to find a small boot sticking out from under a heap of blankets beside the stove. The rest of the child is buried somewhere beneath the layers: wool, old quilts, perhaps a dog for extra insulation. Their breath fogs the air like a lazy steam engine. When you nudge them awake, they burrow deeper, mumbling something about hibernation. Can't blame them. On a winter morning, in a drafty cabin, staying in bed is practically an act of wisdom. The art of staying warm began early in life here. Babies were swaddled so tightly they looked like little logs by the fire, small bundles of survival wrapped in flannel and hope. Mothers checked them constantly, feeling tiny noses for signs of chill, rubbing their hands to coax back warmth. If you were lucky enough to be a child then, you were never far from someone's worried eye or from the steady glow of a fire that was, quite literally, your lifeline. Older children became part of the nightly ritual of warmth. They fetched firewood from the pile outside, racing the cold before it seeped into their fingers. They carried buckets of water so the morning wouldn't begin with the unpleasant crack of ice. Sometimes they even slept in shifts with their siblings, trading the warm spot like currency. You'd crawl into a bed that someone else had already heated with their small, fidgety body and call it luxury. There were, of course, tricks. Some families heated stones in the fire and wrapped them in cloth to tuck near little feet. Others used bottles filled with hot water, primitive, heavy, and prone to leaking, but still miraculous. Children learned to sleep in layers, 2 shirts, 1 nightdress, socks, sometimes even mittens, if the night was bitter enough. Hats were not just for daytime either. Frontier children often slept in knitted caps, waking with the brim frozen to their eyebrows if they were unlucky. And yet somehow they found joy in all of it. They turned the cold into play. Frost on the window pane became a map of imaginary lands. Their breath became smoke dragons. They laughed at the squeak of snow beneath boots, at icicles long enough to be swords. You'd hear their giggles echoing through the hard air, bright and defiant, as if daring the winter to try harder. Inside, they'd crowd around the fire for story time, wide-eyed and pink-cheeked, their shadows dancing against the wall. Tales of bears, blizzards, and long journeys blended with the hiss of sap in the logs. Sometimes the stories were made up. Sometimes they were just memories dressed in exaggeration. Either way, they kept the dark from feeling too large. Of course, not every night was cheerful. Sometimes the fire burned too low or the blankets were too thin. Children woke shivering, their noses numb, their dreams chased away by the cold. On those nights, a parent might lift them out of bed and sit them near the fire, wrapped together under a single shawl. The rhythm of the parent's breathing, the crackle of the coals, the warmth slowly returning to numb fingers, these became the lullabies of the West. If you were a child then, you learned early that warmth was never guaranteed. You learned to share it, guard it, and sometimes laugh at its absence. You learned that a patch of sunlight through the frosted window could feel like grace itself. By day, they'd run outside regardless, sledding on shovels, chasing chickens that regretted leaving the coop, daring each other to touch the frozen pump handle and learning quickly why that was a bad idea. Childhood in the West wasn't easy, but it was inventive. The art of staying warm was less about comfort and more about attitude. You didn't fight the cold, you learned to dance with it. And when night returned, the same little hands that threw snowballs would help stack wood again. Tuck the dog inside and crawl into their shared beds with a sigh of relief. The cold never really left, but it softened thin by laughter, family, and the fierce energy of life that refuses to go numb. You might think of them even now, when you hear the faint laughter of children outside in winter, those small, tireless flames of warmth in a frozen world. No matter how careful you were, no matter how many times you banked the coals, stirred the ashes, or whispered a hopeful prayer before bed, every frontier household faced the same small disaster: the fire went out. It was never a dramatic event. There was no warning cry or puff of smoke. It simply faded slowly, quietly, until the last ember turned gray, and the heart of the room grew cold. You always knew the moment it happened, even before you opened your eyes. The air felt wrong, too still, too sharp. The cold was not just around you, but inside you, creeping into the bones before you had the chance to fight back. You sit up under a mountain of blankets, breath misting like a ghost in the dark. The silence feels heavy, as if the whole cabin is holding its breath. No crackle from the hearth, no faint hum of life. It's just the low moan of the wind outside, pressing against the shutters like a reminder that it's waiting to be invited in. Getting up is a test of courage. The floorboards bite with frost as your bare feet touch them. You pull on whatever clothes you can find, still half asleep, still muttering curses that sound more like prayers, and stumble toward the hearth. The ashes are pale, the logs hollowed and lifeless. The smell of last night's smoke lingers faintly, a ghost of warmth that mocks you with its memory. You poke at the coals, hoping for a flicker. Nothing. The fire has died completely. There's only one thing to do now: bring it back. In towns, you might have a match or two tucked away, precious as gold. But out here, miles from any store, matches are rationed like hope. Most folks carried a tinderbox instead: flint, steel, and a bit of charred cloth or dried moss. Your fingers, stiff with cold, fumble with the tools. The first strike produces only a dull spark. The second, nothing. On the third, a flash of light. You hold your breath, coax it carefully, shielding it from the draft. You whisper encouragements to the spark as if it's a skittish animal. Come on, stay with me now. The smell of sulfur bites at your nose, and smoke curls upward, thin and uncertain. You feed it gently dry bark, a few shavings of pine, then a splinter of kindling. It catches at last a fragile orange bloom in the gray dawn. The relief that floods through you is almost embarrassing. It's only fire, after all. But in the Wild West, only fire was the difference between life and death, between warmth and frostbite, between a home and an empty, frozen box of regrets. If you failed to rekindle it, there was always the other option: go begging. You'd pull on your boots, wrap yourself in a coat, and trudge through the snow to the nearest neighbor, clutching an iron pan or bucket filled with ashes to carry a few precious coals. It was a quiet kind of shame, showing up on another's doorstep, teeth chattering, to ask for fire like a favor. But no one refused. Everyone knew the dread of waking to a cold hearth. The frontier had no patience for pride when frost was involved. Sometimes the fire went out in the middle of the night, unnoticed, until morning brought the consequences. You'd wake to a cabin so cold your breath hung in the air like fog. The water bucket frozen solid and the bread turned to stone. The walls themselves seemed to exhale chill, and you'd find frost on the inside of the windows' delicate patterns that looked like lace if you weren't too miserable to appreciate them. Children would burrow deeper under quilts, pretending to be asleep, hoping someone else would face the icy chore of rekindling the fire. The unlucky adult who rose first would stomp and mutter, blowing into numb fingers, the reluctant hero of the morning. When at last the flames roared again, everyone emerged slowly, sheepish but grateful, basking in that returning glow as though it were sunlight. There was always a moment right after the fire returned to life, when the house seemed to sigh, expanding with relief. The walls creaked, the frost began to melt, and the familiar rhythm of existence resumed. Only then did you truly notice how dependent you were on this fragile, flickering heart of warmth. You might have survived without plenty of things: sugar, sleep, company, but not without fire. It was the center of every story, every meal, every night's small salvation. Losing it, even for a few hours, reminded you how thin the barrier was between survival and surrender. Later, when the day brightened and the smell of burning pine filled the room, you'd glance at the revived flames and promise yourself you'd never let them go out again. You'd bank them carefully that night, build the hearth higher, double-check the shutters. But deep down, you knew it would happen again someday. The cold always waited, patient, silent, certain. Out here, warmth wasn't just something that came from a fire, it came from people. It's the kind of people who would walk half a mile through knee-deep snow to knock on your door. Oh my God. Because they had much to spare, but because they knew what it meant to be cold. In the Wild West, where the land was wide and lonely, and every mile felt like a frontier of its own, neighbors were the difference between freezing alone and surviving together. You learn early on that warmth, like food or shelter, is a thing best shared. When your own cabin fire sputtered, or the roof leaked snow onto your bed, you didn't hesitate to head toward a neighbor's light. Sometimes you didn't even need to ask. You'd see that faint orange glow through the trees, a promise that someone else was awake, tending their own battle against the cold, and you'd follow it. Boots crunching through ice until the smell of wood smoke grew strong enough to make your eyes sting. Inside, the warmth hit you like a blanket, not the polite kind, either the smothering, all-consuming kind that wrapped itself around your bones and said, "You're safe here for now." You'd stamp your feet by the door, hang up a coat so stiff with frost it could almost stand on its own, and join whoever was huddled near the hearth. Conversation wasn't mandatory. Sometimes the only sound was the hiss of pine sap bursting in the fire and the slow drip of melted ice falling from your hat. Neighbors didn't need words to understand each other's gratitude. Everyone had faced the same long nights, the same frozen mornings, the same desperate attempts to keep the fire alive when the wind wanted it gone. Out here, you didn't talk about generosity, you just lived it. Sometimes it wasn't just people who came looking for warmth. Stray dogs, half-wild cats, even the occasional runaway chicken would appear at your door in a storm. Of course, you let them in. A creature with a heartbeat was a heat source, and besides, the West was no place to turn anyone or anything away. The result was often chaos. A cabin filled with mismatched beings, each snoring in a different pitch, all bound together by necessity and smoke. Winter gatherings were their own kind of salvation. Families would take turns hosting, each offering whatever heat they could spare. The houses weren't large, but somehow everyone fit. You'd sit shoulder to shoulder, trading stories, sharing stew, maybe even passing around a bottle to ward off the last bits of chill. The children would fall asleep in heaps under coats and blankets, their cheeks red from the heat of the fire and the excitement of being indoors with company. And when it was time to leave, the host would always insist half stern, half kind, that you stay until dawn. No sense walking home in the dark, they'd say, even if you both knew it was really about keeping each other alive, 'cause a walk through frozen prairie after midnight wasn't an act of bravery. It was an invitation to meet your maker in the snow. There were other kinds of shared warmth, to the quieter, more human kind. You might lend a neighbor your only dry blanket after their roof collapsed under a snowstorm, or you'd leave half your firewood pile at their door without saying a word, pretending the wind must have done it. Sometimes even a shared cup of coffee at sunrise, strong enough to melt a horseshoe. Weak enough to taste like bark was its own small comfort. The strangest thing about those moments was how easy they made hardship feel. You could spend a whole day hauling frozen logs or mending drafty walls, and still end the night laughing by someone else's fire. Misery, it turned out, was lighter when divided among friends. Of course, there were exceptions. Not every neighbor was friendly, and not every visit was welcome. There were people who hoarded their heat, guarding their fire like a dragon guarding gold. You could see it in the way their chimneys smoked constantly while yours stayed cold. But even then, on the worst nights, those same people would eventually open the door. Because the thing about cold is it humbles everyone eventually. When spring finally arrived and the world began to thaw, you'd look back on those long, freezing months with something that almost felt like fondness. You'd remember the nights spent shoulder to shoulder, the shared jokes, the borrowed warmth, and realize that the real fire had never just been in the hearth. It had been in the simple act of not letting anyone freeze alone. And as you chopped next winter's wood or patched the cracks in your walls, you'd do it with a quiet sort of faith. You knew, deep down, that no matter how bitter the wind grew or how far the snow stretched, someone out there would always strike a match if your fire went out. Because in the Wild West, warmth wasn't a possession, it was a promise. A silent, glowing understanding passed between neighbors, one ember at a time. It begins not with sunshine, but with sound. One morning, after what feels like an eternity of silence, you hear it the faint, deliberate drip of melting snow sliding off the roof.
Ow.
It's a quiet rebellion against winter's rain, a slow percussion marking the start of something softer. You lie still on your straw mattress, unsure if you're dreaming, and then it comes again. Drip, drip, drip. The sound of thaw, the world finally exhaling. The air in the cabin feels different too. It still bites at your fingers, but not with the same cruelty. When you breathe out, your breath doesn't hang in the air like a ghost. Anymore, it dissolves quickly, as if the cold is losing interest in haunting you. The fire, once a desperate companion, burns lower now. It doesn't need to rage, it only needs to glow. You stretch beneath the pile of quilts, noticing that for the first time in months, you're not afraid to push one aside. Outside, the transformation is cautious. The snow doesn't disappear overnight. Tight slumps, defeated in uneven mounds. The ground beneath it is soggy and smells faintly of rot and rebirth. You can hear streams waking up, gurgling through ditches where ice had ruled. The air carries that strange mix of scents only spring knows how to make: mud, wet wood, thawing hay, and faintly manure. It's not pleasant, but it's alive. At night, you sleep differently. Gone are the layers of wool and the stiff cocoon of shared blankets. You still bundle up? Of course you're not foolish, but there's a new lightness in the air. As though the season itself is tucking you in gently instead of daring you to survive till dawn. You drift into sleep faster now, not because you're exhausted from fighting the cold, but because, for the first time in months, you don't have to fight at all. The sleep of spring is a luxurious kind of exhaustion. You spend your days slogging through mud, clearing branches broken by snow, checking if the chickens are still laying, or if the roof held through the last storm. Your muscles ache differently now, not from shivering, but from use. And when you fall into bed, you don't shiver yourself awake. You simply sleep. Long, heavy, dreamless sleep. The kind that feels earned. Even the nights sound different. Instead of the hollow whistle of wind through gaps in the walls, there est the rhythmic plink of melting icicles and the distant croak of frogs testing their voices again. You might even hear coyotes, though they sound less menacing now, more like background music to a life returning to balance. You pull the quilt a little higher under your chin and smile to yourself. No need to sleep with one eye open for fire or frostbite. Just rest. It's strange, though, how the end of hardship brings its own kind of emptiness. You spent so long surviving the cold that now, with warmth returning, there's a part of you that doesn't quite know what to do with ease. You wake up too early, out of habit, half expecting to find the embers dead and the cabin frozen. But the air stays kind, and your breath doesn't cloud, and for a moment you lie still, letting the unfamiliar comfort sink in. Spring also changes the rhythm of the community. The same neighbors who huddled by shared fires all winter now meet in doorways, squinting at the sun, swapping stories about roofs that leaked and fires that almost went out. There's laughter again, the unhurried kind that sounds like relief. Someone might bring over a loaf of bread baked with the last of their winter flour, and you return the favor with a jar of syrup tapped from the newly waking trees. And at night, the conversation's quiet. You lie in bed listening to the faint creak of the thawing earth, the rustle of the wind shaking loose the last icicles from the eaves. The sound of it feels like closure, a gentle reminder that the world always rights itself, eventually. You can almost feel the ground warming under your feet, the promise of new shoots ready to burst through the muck. Your sleep deepens with the season. There's a sweetness to it now, a trust that the fire won't fail you, that tomorrow won't freeze your breath midair. It's not just sleep, it's recovery. The mind unwinding from months of vigilance, the body finally allowed to rest without fear. You dream not of survival, but of small, beautiful things, sunlight through curtains, the smell of damp soil, a stream running fast enough to sing again. When you wake in the morning, light spills through the cracks in the shutters, soft, golden, forgiving. The cabin smells of earth instead of smoke. You open the door, and the air that greets you is still cold, yes, but no longer cruel. You take it in with a long, grateful breath and realize something simple. You made it. The thaw is more than weather, it's a kind of mercy. A quiet, unspoken reward for all those nights you didn't think you'd see through. And as the land stretches and warms and breathes again, so do you. The sleep of spring isn't just rest, it's rebirth. And soon, as the green starts creeping back over the plains and the first buds open against the still cold wind, you'll remember what it feels like to dream of things beyond warmth. But for now, you stay under your quilt a little longer, listening to the drip of melting snow, and let yourself drift because tomorrow, life begins again. And maybe, just maybe, tonight you'll sleep with the window cracked open, just a little, to hear the world come back to life. There was a time not long ago, though it feels like another life, when warmth wasn't a given. You earned it the hard way, with sweat and smoke and stubbornness. You chopped the wood, carried it in, coaxed the fire to life, and guarded it through the night like a fragile secret. Each spark was precious. Each log, a small victory against the dark. But now, as the days lengthen and the air softens, warmth has turned from a battle into a luxury. You can feel it most in the mornings. No longer do you wake with a stiff neck and cold toes, or the dread of stepping onto an icy floor. The air inside the cabin holds a gentle stillness, the kind that doesn't demand anything from you. You stretch beneath your blankets and realize almost guiltily that you're not racing against frost anymore. The stove burns not out of desperation now, but comfort. The flame inside is smaller, steady, domestic. You don't hover near it anymore. You pass by it like an old friend you no longer have to worry about. It's a strange adjustment, this abundance of heat. You almost miss the urgency of it, the way a winter night made every ember feel alive. You can leave your cup of coffee unattended and come back to find it still warm. You can sit by the window and let the sunlight do what no fire ever quite managed to soak into your bones without smoke in your eyes. You're reminded that warmth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply rests around you, easy and quiet. And yet, because you've known the cold, you notice things others might not. You catch yourself savoring small luxuries: warm bread, the weight of a quilt, the sun on your back. You handle each one with a reverence that feels almost old-fashioned. It's the kind of gratitude born only from deprivation. Once you've gone to bed wearing your coat, you never take an ordinary morning for granted again. You remember the smell of smoke that clung to everything, your clothes, your hair, the walls. It used to mean survival. Now as it fades from the cabin, you almost miss it. You miss the ritual of stoking the fire before sleep, of banking embers under ash so you'd have a spark come morning. There was something grounding about it, simple, direct, and purposeful. The fire burns more for company than necessity. Its crackle a kind of nostalgia. Warmth also changes how you see people. During the cold months, neighbors were lifelines. You shared fires, blankets, and silences. Now with the thaw, you see them outdoors against plitting logs, not for emergency, but for the next season. They smile more easily. Their shoulders loosen. The conversations turn from survival to plans. New fences, spring planting, maybe even a trip to town if the roads hold. The warmth doesn't just loosen the ground, it loosens the human spirit. Still, on certain evenings, as the air cools and twilight settles over the prairie, you can feel the echo of winter. It lingers not as fear, but as memory, a reminder that comfort is temporary, that every fire must be tended, every luxury earned. You find yourself adding another log to the stove anyway, just for the comfort of watching it burn. The light flickers on the walls, and for a moment, it feels like you're back in those long nights of careful patience. Warmth, when you have it, makes you generous. You might invite a traveler inside, offer them stew, a dry blanket, a seat near the stove. You know what it's like to arrive frozen and desperate for heat. The smallest act, pouring someone a mug of something hot, feels sacred. Maybe that's the real luxury, not just the heat itself, but the freedom to share it. You begin to notice the quiet textures of warmth, too. The way sunlight hits the window pane at dawn and leaves soft patterns across the floorboards. The faint hum of life returning, flies tapping at the glass, the creak of wood expanding as it dries. Even the cat sprawled by the stove looks like a sermon on comfort, purring in its sleep, unbothered by the world outside. When you crawl into bed at night, the quilts feel lighter. You don't have to bury yourself anymore. You can let the air move, let your body breathe. You fall asleep easily, not out of exhaustion or defense, but because rest has become safe again. There's no need to keep one ear open for the hiss of dying embers or the groan of timbers freezing in the wind. The house holds steady. You've earned this calm. And as you lie there listening to the slow rhythm of the fire and the faint rustle of spring beyond the walls, do you realize something quietly profound? Warmth is not just a physical state, it's a kind of faith. Faith that tomorrow will be kind, that the wood will last, that the seasons, in their endless patience, will always find their way back to gentleness. You've survived the bitter cold and learned to cherish the small, glowing graces it left behind. Warmth, after all, is sweetest to those who've known the chill. Even with spring settled and warmth returning, sleep on the frontier was never guaranteed. You might have survived the cold, but rest was another matter entirely. There's a particular kind of wakefulness that belongs only to wide, empty lands. The kind that sneaks into your mind after dark, when the world outside is too still for comfort. You lie there, eyes open to the flicker of the dying fire, and every sound feels larger than life. The creak of the cabin timbers, the far-off howl of a coyote, the low, steady groan of the wind dragging itself across the plains. It isn't the noise that keeps you awake, it's the space between the noises. The vastness, the thought that there is nothing between you and hundreds of miles of darkness but a thin wooden wall and your own imagination. Out here, insomnia doesn't come from stress about bills or deadlines, it comes from silence and distance. The mind, left alone too long with itself, starts to wander. Start thinking about home, about the places you left behind, about how absurd it is that humans ever thought they could tame this kind of land. You remember the faces of the people who didn't make it through the last winter, and you wonder if they found peace in their sleep or just stopped fighting the cold. The body lies still, but the mind roams, following the faint trail of old wagon ruts disappearing into moonlight. You think about the first settlers who came through, sleeping under nothing but hides and hope. You imagine their sleepless nights, their fear of wolves, of bandits, of the unknown pressing in. And you realize that maybe insomnia isn't a modern curse at all. Maybe it's as old as humanity's first night under open sky. Your bed doesn't help. Straw mattress creaks and sighs with every shift. The blanket itches. There is a splinter in the floor that keeps finding your heel no matter which way you turn. The room smells of wood smoke and iron, and the faint must of damp earth still clinging from the thaw. It's familiar, even comforting, but not restful. You roll onto your side, pull the quilt tighter, and try to count your breaths instead of the minutes. Outside, the wind plays its slow, low tune against the eaves. Sometimes it sounds almost like words half-formed, ghostly mutters that rise and fade. It's easy to see why old-timers swore the wind could drive a person mad. Too much quiet, too much dark, too much time to listen to what isn't really there. You tell yourself it's just air and wood, but that doesn't stop your mind from filling the gaps. Insomnia out here isn't entirely unpleasant, though. There's a strange intimacy to being awake when the world is asleep. You feel the heartbeat of the cabin, the soft pop of cooling logs, the distant shuffle of the horse in its stall, the steady tick of your own breath. The firelight stretches shadows across the walls, long and soft, like the memory of daylight refusing to leave. You realize how alive the night is in its own hushed way. Sometimes, when sleep won't come, you get up. You throw on your coat, step outside, and let the night meet you face to face. The air is cool but gentle, the kind that brushes your skin without biting. Above, the sky feels endless, more stars than sense. They stretch in every direction, spilling across the heavens like someone scattered a bag of salt on black velvet. Standing there, it's hard to remember why you were restless at all. The loneliness you felt inside turns into something else, something bigger, quieter, steadier. You take a few deep breaths, the smell of thawing earth, the faint smoke from your chimney, the clean, thin chill of open air. All feels like medicine. Maybe that's how people here survive the long nights. Not by sleeping through them, but by learning to rest with their eyes open. Still, there are nights when even the stars don't help. Nights when your thoughts refuse to quiet, circling back again and again to what's been lost, what's uncertain, what lies beyond that horizon. On those nights, you do what everyone does eventually. You surrender to the rhythm of wakefulness. You listen to the sounds of the night until they stop feeling foreign. You stop trying to sleep, and in that surrender, rest finally finds you. Because out here, sleep isn't something you take. It's something that takes you when it's ready. By morning, when the sky begins to pale and the first light touches the frost on the grass, you'll have drifted off for an hour or two, maybe less. It won't feel like enough, but it will be. The frontier doesn't reward deep dreamers. It rewards the ones who can live on small mercies. And as you wake with the dawn stiff, bleary-eyed, but alluvial, know that insomnia isn't your enemy. It's just another frontier to survive. Another long stretch of darkness that reminds you how vast the world still is, and how quietly you've learned to belong to it. Tomorrow night, maybe sleep will come easier, or maybe it won't. Either way, you'll light the fire, pull up the quilt, and listen again to the breathing of the land. Because even in sleeplessness, the West keeps watch. You live now in an age where warmth is as simple as a switch. One click, and the room glows. One dial, and the chill retreats. The hum of a heater has replaced the crackle of a fire, and you can fall asleep without ever thinking about kindling or wind. But sometimes when the night grows still, and the light from your screen fades, you feel it, that faint restless echo from the frontier. The sense that somewhere deep in your bones, a part of you still remembers how it felt to fight for warmth. You lie in your bed, soft, clean, predictable, and yet there's something hollow in the comfort. The sheets are smooth, the thermostat steady, and still, a strange nostalgia stirs. Maybe it's the quiet hum of the radiator, imitating the old whisper of fire. Maybe it's the faint hiss of wind outside, reminding you that, even now, nature is just one wall away. Or maybe it's because warmth, when it's too easy, loses a bit of its wonder. Think about the settlers you've followed through this story, the ones who slept under patchwork quilts and roofs that leaked snow onto their faces. They didn't have heated blankets or double-pane windows. Their nights were measured not by hours, but by how long the fire lasted. Every ember was a prayer, every morning a quiet triumph. And though their world was harsher, their comfort meant more precisely because it had to be earned. We've built better shelters, but perhaps we've lost the small ceremonies that came with survival. The ritual of stacking wood, of blowing gently on coals until they caught. The satisfaction of feeling the air shift from bitter to bearable because of your own two hands. Now, the only thing we stoke is a screen, glowing blue instead of orange, and somehow colder for it. And yet, that frontier restlessness hasn't gone away, it's just changed shape. You feel it when you can't fall asleep, even though you're warm and safe. When the hum of modern life grows too constant, too sterile, and you find yourself missing the unpredictable rhythm of real flame. The insomnia of the frontier still lingers, disguised as the insomnia of the city, both born from the same unease. The same awareness that comfort doesn't quiet every fear. Perhaps that's why people still light candles. Why we gather around campfires, fireplaces, even scented wax burners as if to remind ourselves what warmth used to feel like. It's not just about heat, it's about company. It's about light that moves, breathes, responds. It's about the sound of something alive, however small, crackling in the dark. We build fake flames into our modern live screensavers, holiday displays, gas logs, because deep down, we miss the real thing. And maybe that's why history matters. Not just the grand events, but the quiet, ordinary struggles. The nights when staying alive meant tending a flame. You don't need to live in a log cabin to understand what it means to fight off the cold. Everyone knows the feeling in some form, the long night, the dim light, the hope that morning will come soon. Tonight, you can pull your blanket up without worry. Your room is sealed from the wind, your fire tamed to electricity, but as you drift towards sleep, you might picture that little cabin against the one standing alone against the endless prairie, smoke curling into the night. You can almost hear the hiss of the logs, smell the faint sweetness of pine resin, feel the rough wool of a hand-stitched quilt. Somewhere in that image is the truest warmth there is, the kind born not from comfort, but from care. The modern world hums along, efficient and bright, but part of you still belongs to that quiet place. The one where the only light came from flame, and the only sound at night was the wind and your own breathing. That memory isn't about nostalgia for hardship. It's about remembering what makes comfort meaningful. So when you turn off the lamp, when the heater clicks softly in the dark, let yourself imagine that distant fire again. Picture it steady and small, its glow moving gently across wooden walls. Somewhere, someone long ago is watching the same dance of shadows, hoping for the same thing you are now. Good night's sleep, a little warmth, and the promise of another dawn. Because even in your modern bed, under your modern quilt, you're not so different from them. The cold may not reach you, but the memory of it, what it taught, what it tested, still flickers somewhere inside. And as you settle into the quiet hum of your safe, heated room, you might finally understand what they knew all along. That warmth in any century is more than heat. It's a kind of gratitude, small, glowing proof that you've made it through the dark. And as that thought drifts through you like firelight on a calm wall, your eyes grow heavier. The past fades gently into the present, and for a moment, two worlds meet, yours and theirs, both wrapped in the same timeless warmth. As our story of winter nights on the frontier draws to an end, the last ember glows quietly in the hearth of memory. Those who came before us did not dream of comfort the way we do. They dreamed of survival, of waking to see another sunrise over the frozen plains. Yet in their small victories and every spark they coaxed to life, there was something deeply human. The will to endure, and the grace to find peace even in the bitterest cold. Their nights were long and uncertain. The wind rattled through gaps in the walls, and the frost painted delicate ghosts across the windows. But they had each other, the soft breath of animals close by, the faint glow of firelight on rough-hewn walls. In those quiet, half-lit hours, they wove stories, whispered prayers, and drifted between fear and gratitude, draped not just in blankets, but in the warmth of shared existence. Today, we inherit their comfort. The hum of our heaters, the glow of our lamps, the ease with which we close out the night, all of it built on the lessons of their struggle. We no longer sleep beside livestock or tend fires until dawn, yet something in us still honors that ancient ritual of keeping the dark at bay. It lives in the way we light candles on cold evenings, or pull a quilt tighter around us, or feel a small, quiet thankfulness when the warmth settles in. Perhaps that is the true legacy of those who slept through brutal winters in the Wild West. Not just endurance, but awareness. A reminder that warmth, however ordinary it feels now, was once a triumph. that behind every comfort lies a history of hands that worked, hearts that hoped, and fires that refused to die out. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let that thought settle softly over you like an old quilt. You are part of that long story. The wind may no longer whistle through your walls, but the same human spirit that faced the cold with courage still burns, quietly within you. Sleep well then. The fire has not gone out. Tit has only changed form. It burns now in memory, in gratitude, and in the simple, enduring warmth of being alive.